On February 24, 2010, in a residential area of Daeokpo-dong in Sasang District, Busan. At approximately 7:07 p.m., 13-year-old Lee had a brief 3-minute phone conversation with her mother. Around 9 p.m., when Lee's 15-year-old brother returned home, he discovered his sister was not there. Initially, he thought Lee might have gone out to meet friends. However, something was very unusual. Lee had poor eyesight to the point where she couldn't identify objects without wearing glasses, yet her glasses remained at home. Not only that, her phone was still there, her pocket money hadn't been touched, and notably she had left in her pajamas. All these details were completely illogical and alarming. At around 10:50 p.m., immediately after receiving the report from the family, police promptly deployed forces, searching throughout the surrounding area, but finding no trace of the girl. It wasn't until the next morning, after a thorough inspection, that they discovered suspicious signs. Someone had broken into the Lee family's home. Strange footprints appeared both inside and outside the house, clearly showing this was not an ordinary disappearance. Immediately, police upgraded the case from a missing person to a kidnapping and conducted a confidential investigation to protect Lee's safety. The area where the crime occurred was a neighborhood in a partially developed stage. A few residents still lived there, but most had relocated elsewhere, leaving many abandoned houses. These empty homes inadvertently became ideal hiding places for the perpetrator after committing the kidnapping. Although police conducted a thorough search, the investigation still made no significant progress. Police quickly turned their attention to the criminal element in this case, with a key suspect identified: Gil-tae, a resident living right in the area. This was not an unfamiliar name to law enforcement. Gil-tae carried an alarming criminal record, from kidnapping, unlawful detention to violence, which had caused him to spend 11 years behind bars. Particularly, just 1 month before the incident in January, Gil-tae had been placed on the police wanted list with similar charges of kidnapping and violence. When police checked Gil-tae's home, they only found his parents, with no sign of the subject himself. The search of the family home yielded no significant results. However, a surprise appeared when they checked the abandoned house next to the Lee family's home. There, police collected numerous fingerprints. After comparison, the result was undeniable. These fingerprints matched perfectly with Gil-tae's. From this, police hypothesized that Gil-tae had used this abandoned house as a hideout to avoid capture. A painful truth gradually became clear. If police had caught Gil-tae earlier, perhaps this tragic case would not have occurred. Although the situation seemed serious, police still maintained hope that Lee would return safely. The reason for this optimism came from Gil-tae's criminal record. Despite having many previous convictions for kidnapping and violence, he had never crossed the boundary of crime to the point of causing murder. Therefore, while identifying this as a criminal case, police still believed the situation was not too severe. They believed that even if Gil-tae couldn't be found, he would eventually release Lee. But time passed mercilessly. 4 long days had gone by without any new clues, and Lee had still not returned home. With the increasingly tense situation on February 27th, police decided to change the case from a confidential investigation to a public one. They widely published related information and offered a generous reward, 5 million Korean won, approximately $4,500, for anyone providing information leading to Gil-tae's capture. All forces that could be mobilized were deployed, focusing on the Daeokpo-dong area in a tireless search effort. 4 days after the public investigation was launched, on the morning of March 3rd, a glimmer of hope appeared when police were patrolling near the Lee home. They unexpectedly spotted Gil-tae in the area. However, before they could approach, the suspect took advantage of his quick reflexes, jumping from a 10-foot-high wall to the ground and quickly disappearing into the darkness. Once again, Gil-tae slipped from the grasp of the law. The manhunt was intensified on a larger scale. Just 2 days later, on the evening of March 6th, an unusual call came from Mr. Kwon, a 66-year-old man living in the area. His voice trembled over the phone. "In our water tank, there seems to be something very strange." Sensing something ominous, police immediately arrived at the scene. a location just 164 feet away from the Lee family's home. The water tank appeared before their eyes with an eerily unusual appearance. The tank lid wasn't closed normally, but was weighed down by many large bricks. When opened, the tank didn't contain water as usual, nor was it completely empty, but was filled with chaotic objects stacked hastily on top of each other, as if someone was trying to hide something underneath. With extreme caution, investigators began to remove the layers of materials inside the water tank. First, they lifted out a large black bag. Inside were some clothes and shoes. As they dug deeper, they encountered a layer of stones and tiles stacked on top of each other like a barrier. Beneath this layer of material, they discovered a hardened cement surface, a clear sign of a deliberate attempt to permanently conceal something. After tireless efforts to break through the cement layer, the worst was confirmed. At the bottom of the water tank, curled up in another black bag, was Lee's body, the girl who had gone missing more than a week before. The scene before them made even the most experienced police officers shudder. Her hands and feet were tightly bound, with no clothes covering her body. Evidence of the perpetrator's inhumane brutality. A girl just 13 years old, standing at the threshold of life, had to face such a tragic and heartbreaking end. News of the case quickly spread, sowing horror and confusion throughout the local community. Not only ordinary citizens, but even the police force was deeply shocked, not just by the victim's tragic condition, but also by the realization that all their previous assumptions had been completely wrong. This also marked an alarming shift in Gil-tae's method of crime. Unlike previous cases, this was the first time he had daringly broken into a home to kidnap, and ultimately pushed his crime to the extreme by brutally and calculatedly murdering his victim. 2 days after the heartbreaking discovery of the body, an official report from the Korean National Institute of Scientific Investigation confirmed the worst. The victim had been sexually assaulted before her death. More notably, forensic scientists found traces of Gil-tae's DNA on the victim's body, irrefutable evidence connecting him to this horrific crime. With undeniable evidence, Gil-tae was officially identified as the prime suspect, and his capture became the highest priority for authorities. However, in an unexpected development, shortly thereafter, Gil-tae himself proactively contacted the police through his father's phone. With a cold tone, he denied any connection to the murder, and once again disappeared into the darkness. Initially, police thought Gil-tae might have left the Sasang district of Busan, seeking refuge at a more distant location, and they prepared to expand the search area. However, criminal behavioral analysis experts offered a different perspective, based on deep understanding of the subject's psychology. They pointed out that, after 11 years living in a prison environment, Gil-tae had developed extreme anxiety and a severe fear of social interaction. Moreover, he didn't own a mobile phone, didn't have a driver's license, and didn't even use the internet. All factors making it difficult for him to travel far. Analyzing the combination of psychological and behavioral factors, experts concluded that Gil-tae was likely still hiding within a range not far from his home or the crime scene. This hypothesis was soon proven when police received unusual reports from a market near the crime scene. Food there was consistently being stolen. This sign further reinforced the conclusion that Gil-tae was hiding nearby and had to steal food to sustain himself. March 10, 2010, marked an important turning point in the manhunt. At 2:45 p.m., during a routine check at an apartment complex in Samrak-dong, Sasang District, Busan, police made a decisive discovery. When the door leading to the rooftop was opened, Gil-tae, the man the entire police force was hunting, stood right before them. With the reflexes of a professional fugitive, Gil-tae immediately deployed his escape plan. He daringly jumped from one building to another, like a risky acrobatic performance. When left with no choice, he tried to slide down through the narrow gap between two buildings, pressing his feet and back against the opposing walls to slow his fall, a climbing technique requiring considerable skill and strength. Although he landed safely, Gil-tae didn't stop but continued rushing toward a nearby parking lot, perhaps hoping to find a vehicle to escape. But fate was not on his side. A police officer patrolling nearby recognized the situation and immediately reacted with a bold lunge, capturing Gil-tae in a spectacular chase. So, 15 days after Lee's disappearance, 12 days after the public wanted notice was issued, and 5 days after the heartbreaking discovery of the body, Kim Gil-tae, the main 33-year-old suspect, was finally brought to justice. A long, painful, intense journey finally concluded with the successful capture of the man who had caused terror throughout the community. Although arrested, Gil-tae still maintained an attitude of complete denial. With an emotionless face, he claimed he had never once met the victim Lee. When police questioned his reason for running, he cleverly deflected, blaming the violence case from January. "I was running because of the violence case last month. It has nothing to do with this." However, forensic science spoke convincingly. Gil-tae's DNA had been found on Lee's body, irrefutable evidence connecting him to the crime. Faced with this decisive evidence, Gil-tae only responded with a deceptive statement. "I don't know what DNA is. You just proceed according to the law." After that, he refused to give any further testimony. The 20-year age gap between Gil-tae and the young victim is a notable detail. Combined with his previous record of kidnapping and rape, his profile is not just a list of crimes, but a clear portrait of an individual with deep antisocial personality characteristics, a form of psychological disorder that even the best rehabilitation educators must concede defeat to. To gain a deeper insight into this complex and frightening individual, we need to trace back through his past, exploring Gil-tae's criminal timeline. A journey of crime that gradually escalated from minor law violations to the most horrific crimes. Gil-tae's story begins in 1977 in what seemed like a moment of destiny. One peaceful morning, a couple walked through the gates of a church and unexpectedly discovered an abandoned baby boy, still wrapped in a thin blanket. They saw this as a sacred sign, a predetermined fate. With that strong belief, they decided to adopt the child and named him Kim Gil-tae. Gil-tae's family life unfolded in poverty, with simple meals and a cramped house. Nevertheless, in his early years, Gil-tae stood out with a gentle, quiet personality. Notably, the relationship between him and his adoptive father was unusually harsh. This man imposed an iron discipline on his adopted son, where slaps and punches became as familiar as daily bread in Gil-tae's everyday life. The boy gradually became accustomed to physical pain, but the psychological wounds grew increasingly deep. It seemed that deep down, Gil-tae always had a vague sense of his true identity. Unanswered questions about his origins, about the difference in treatment, silently gnawed at the boy's young soul. It wasn't until high school that the truth was cruelly revealed. Gil-tae was not the biological child of this family. This confirmation became a breaking point, like a powerful chemical catalyst, completely transforming Gil-tae. From a quiet teenager, Gil-tae transformed into a completely different person, hypersensitive, easily angered, violent, and seemingly losing the ability to control his emotions. Disappointed with life and himself, Gil-tae dropped out during his first year of high school, choosing to work at a bar, a complex environment where the darkness of nightlife gradually swallowed the broken soul of the teenager. 1994 marked Gil-tae's first step into crime, when at age 17 he was sent to a juvenile detention center for theft. 2 years later, on September 10, 1996, the first official sentence was pronounced: 10 months imprisonment for charges of violent injury and intentional property destruction. However, the justice system at that time decided to give Gil-tae a chance, converting the 10-month imprisonment to a 2-year suspended sentence, causing him to be released almost immediately. Unfortunately, this decision did not come with any rehabilitation or education programs. Gil-tae walked out of the courtroom without any psychological support or necessary guidance to reintegrate into society. The consequences of this lack of professional intervention quickly manifested. Less than a year into his suspended sentence, on July 27, 1997, Gil-tae escalated his criminal behavior to an alarming new level. With sophisticated tactics, he lured a young woman walking on the street and dragged her to the roof of an empty building. There, not only did he rob all her money, Gil-tae also intended to sexually assault the victim, Only thanks to a rare stroke of luck, the girl's parents' timely discovery and intervention, was a greater tragedy prevented. This time, the legal system was no longer lenient. In January 1998, Gil-tae faced much more serious consequences. 3 years imprisonment without sentence reduction. 3 years in prison. That should have been enough time for rehabilitation, education, and reshaping a person. But with Gil-tae, the question about the effectiveness of this rehabilitation received a harsh answer. No. Instead, it could be said these 3 years were just time for the dark intentions within him to mature and become more dangerous. Just over a month after being released in early April 2001, Gil-tae began calculating for a new crime. This time with a scale and level of brutality far exceeding previous times. At 4 a.m. on May 30th, 2001, in the thick darkness of late night, Gil-tae snuck into a house near Deokpo Market, Sasang District, Busan. His target was a 32-year-old woman who was praying. With weapon in hand, Gil-tae threatened and subdued the victim, dragging her into an empty room where he committed assault. But unlike previous cases, Gil-tae didn't stop there. With a chilling calculation, he decided to detain the victim, turning her into a prisoner in that very room. Whenever he went out, he carefully locked the door from the outside, ensuring the victim had no chance to escape. He kept her captive. Finally, in a rare moment of luck, when Gil-tae was drunk and deeply asleep, the victim found an opportunity to escape from the invisible chains, running straight to the police station for help. When arrested, Gil-tae concocted an absurdly implausible fictional story to deny guilt. I accidentally met her on the street. She threw seductive glances my way, leading to our relationship and agreement to live together. There was no detention. The reason she left and reported to the police was simply to falsely accuse me of sexual crime with the purpose of extorting compensation money. Not stopping there, concerned that his criminal past would cause him to face unfair treatment from the investigating agency, Gil-tae spent time drafting a 30-page petition in a desperate effort to prove his non-existent innocence. In reality, Gil-tae's defense story completely collapsed in the face of obvious facts. His victim was not an individual living an unstable life as he fabricated, but a woman with a stable family life, a dedicated wife and mother. Each morning, she woke up early, prepared breakfast for her husband before he went to work, woke the children and prepared them for school. A life full of responsibility and routine of an ordinary, hard-working woman. The idea that such a person would voluntarily abandon her family to live with a stranger in a locked room was extremely absurd. The pain the victim had to endure didn't just stop at being physically violated throughout 9 long days. She also had to suffer the humiliation when the very person who had abused her brazenly declared that everything was voluntary. With determination to reclaim justice and honor for herself, she courageously entered the courtroom, directly facing the person who had caused her horror to be a direct witness. At that time in Korea, the punishment for violent sexual offenders was 7 to 8 years. In the first instance judgment, the court recognized him as a serious offender and sentenced him to 12 years imprisonment. Gil-tae appealed, and the appellate court actually reduced his sentence by 4 years, ultimately sentencing him to 8 years imprisonment. At that time, the reason given by the court was, apart from being sexually assaulted, the victim did not suffer direct physical injuries. This reason, at that time, caused much criticism. Isn't sexual violence already both physical and mental injury? And Gil-tae even claimed that the victim didn't escape, suggesting consent. The appellate court also acknowledged this illogical defense. Although he had many previous convictions, repeatedly reoffended, and showed no genuine remorse, in the end, nothing could prevent him from having his prison sentence reduced by 4 years. This decision led to the tragedy that occurred later. After serving 8 years, no one knew whether he had truly been educated and thoroughly rehabilitated. On June 26, 2009, Gil-tae completed his prison term and was released. Although his case had once shocked Busan, to protect the privacy of offenders, police had protected and not publicly disclosed his image. Therefore, no one knew that such an unsafe element had appeared beside them. And this demon released from prison continued to commit crimes repeatedly, still in the area around his home. At 4:40 a.m. on January 23, 2010, a 21-year-old woman who had just finished her shift and was walking home was in a small alley in Sasang District, Busan. He threatened her with force, then dragged her to the rooftop of a nearby 3-story building. There, he assaulted and violated the victim. Then at 5 a.m., he dragged the victim to his private home 328 feet away. Similar to his crime process in 2001, he detained the victim for 10 hours, only releasing her after she promised not to report to the police. But the victim still chose to report to the police, and he began to run. This time, we're not just witnessing someone simply fleeing from the law, but also an alarming evolution in the method of crime, from an opportunist to a calculated predator. Looking at how Gil-tae chose crime locations with astonishing precision, it's not difficult to recognize that before acting, he had spent time carefully surveying the terrain, studying the habits of potential victims, all pointing to a crime planned carefully and deliberately from the beginning. While on the run from the arrest warrant, Gil-tae began scouring throughout Deokpodong in Sasang District, searching for abandoned houses as hiding places. Among them, he chose a perfect location for his dark plan, the empty house situated right next to the Lee family's home. This position not only helped him avoid police detection, but also facilitated the monitoring of his next prey. With the shared wall between Gil-tae's hideout and the Lee home, the two houses became a frighteningly unified entity, a perfect mask for the crime being conceived. He ate, slept, and lived there, while constantly observing every movement from the neighboring house through the cracks in the walls, the uncovered window frames. Each movement, each habit of the Lee family gradually became clear in the predator's mind, while the dark impulses inside him grew increasingly strong, beyond his ability to control, urging him to act. And so, 13-year-old Lee, the weakest member of the family, became the next target in Gil-tae's chain of crimes. After many days of silent stalking, Gil-tae had thoroughly understood the daily schedule of each member in the Lee family, knowing exactly when who would be present in the house. With this information, he chose the perfect moment. 1 month after being wanted by the police, on the evening of February 24th, when Lee was home alone, Gil-tae entered through the rear roof window, used force to subdue and kidnap the girl. Unlike previous cases, Gil-tae continuously moved the victim through 2 different locations to carry out his assault. But notably, this time, he didn't choose to continue detaining the victim like his previous crime pattern. Through hard-learned lessons, Gil-tae had come to a chilling conclusion. All victims he had ever detained eventually found ways to escape and report to the police. The belief in his ability to control victims long-term was no longer in his mind. And so, with a frightening leap in the scale of crime, Gil-tae upgraded his criminal method to the most brutal level, completely eliminating the witness, erasing the potential danger that could lead to his detection and capture. On that very day, Gil-tae strangled the victim until she stopped breathing, then threw the body into a large water tank, pouring cement and materials on top to conceal the crime. However, forensic evidence gradually revealed the undeniable truth. Footprints and shoe marks on the victim's floor matched perfectly with traces at Gil-tae's hideout. These shoes were identified as items the family bought for him after his release from prison in 2009. DNA tests from bodily fluids found on the victim and on toilet paper in the black bag all matched Gil-tae. Additionally, his cement pouring action had been discovered by Mr. Kwan, forming an important witness. With complete physical evidence and witnesses, combined with lie detector test results, the legal noose gradually tightened around the murderer. It was during this tense period, under fierce pressure from public opinion, that police decided to publicly disclose Gil-tae's identity and image, an uncommon step in Korean judicial procedures. On March 19, 2010, after completing the investigation process with an undeniable evidence portfolio, police officially transferred Gil-tae to the Busan District Prosecutor's Office to proceed with prosecution procedures. 3 months later, on June 25th, the first instance trial officially opened. Considering the serious previous convictions, The continuous trend of reoffending with increasingly serious nature, and especially the crime that took the life of a 13-year-old girl, the Busan District Prosecutor's Office made a strong request: death penalty. Facing the prospect of paying with his life, Gil-tae employed every tactic to escape punishment. For the case of assaulting the 21-year-old woman, he gave a testimony full of reverse attribution. "On the day of the incident, I was completely drunk and lost control. When I sobered up, I was shocked to find myself hitting someone's face, not even knowing if it was male or female. I immediately stopped and apologized. We then parted ways, but I sought her out to apologize again. At that point, this person then claimed that we had relations when I wasn't sober, demanding 5 million won, approximately $4,500, in compensation and threatening to sue me for rape." For the heartbreaking case of the young Lee, Gil-tae continued to deny responsibility with an equally absurd story. "I barely remember anything. Due to being wanted, I had to constantly hide. One day, after drinking heavily, I passed out. When I woke up, I was shocked to discover on the blanket in the empty house a person lying without any clothes. Looking closer, I realized it was a girl. Although feeling strange, I tried calling her but received no response. It was then I realized she was dead. Panicking extremely, nearly going crazy, I tied her hands and feet with rope and put her in a bag. My next memory is seeing the body in the water tank, and I used a stick to stir cement, then poured it in. When I saw the body wasn't completely covered, a feeling of compassion suddenly rose in my heart, so I used tiles and stones to cover on top. This contradictory and illogical testimony was not convincing enough for the court. In the first instance judgment, considering the particularly serious and cruel nature of the crime, the court pronounced the highest penalty, death penalty for Kim Gil-tae. However, on July 2, 2010, despite facing undeniable evidence, Gil-tae still decided to appeal, even requesting the court to declare him innocent. This audacity wasn't without basis. In the past, appealing had once helped him reduce his sentence by 4 years. Therefore, no matter how slim the chance of reversing the situation, Gil-tae was still determined to try his final luck. On December 15, 2010, the court once again reduced Gil-tae's sentence from death penalty to life imprisonment. There were 4 main reasons from the court. The first reason he sensed from his name that he was born by the roadside. During his upbringing, he felt mistreated by his father and determined he wasn't a biological child, hence receiving such treatment. Subsequently, he began to form a distorted social awareness. Impoverished life, nearly severed family connections. He was a person with a criminal record despised by society. Family and society had not provided him with help and care. Finally, the defendant became a person with a serious antisocial personality disorder that the community found difficult to accept. Considering all these comprehensively, if completely dismissing social responsibility, placing responsibility solely on the individual would truly be too cruel. The second reason, it's difficult to assess whether he has a healthy spirit like normal people, and during the crime process, there existed a state of mental weakness. This term in the Korean judicial system is not unfamiliar. The court had previously requested competent authorities to conduct 2 mental assessments on Gil-tae, results showing he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy and delusional disorder. It cannot be determined whether, when committing the crime, he acted according to his subjective will. The third reason, the defendant never had a plan to kill from the beginning, but only killed excessively when the victim strongly resisted or didn't follow his words. The fourth reason, only when the defendant uses cruel methods to kill an unspecified crowd would the court pronounce death penalty. And because at that time media reported too extensively, public opinion strongly demanded the death penalty, so when pronouncing the first instance judgment, it must have been influenced by outside opinion, leading to excessive punishment. Although he had brutally killed a life to satisfy his desires, limiting or abolishing the death penalty better aligns with the developmental trend of modern civilized society. Just permanently isolating him from society is sufficient. As a serious criminal, he was also sentenced to wear an electronic monitoring device for 20 years. Thus, through these 4 reasons, Gil-tae became a life prisoner. He again achieved the most favorable outcome for himself. Although life imprisonment was already the heaviest practical punishment in Korea, Gil-tae pushed part of the responsibility onto his poor adoptive parents, as their neglect and abuse had led him to this state. However, they had sold recyclable materials and saved 200,000 Korean won, approximately $180, to send to prison for Gil-tae's living expenses during his sentence. They even apologized on his behalf to the victim's family and society. This case continues to spark debate about how Korean society handles sexual and violent offenders, especially those targeting children and vulnerable people. Justice has been served, but for many, it still wasn't true justice. And that is today's case. Thank you for watching and see you in the next videos.